This week's highest new chart entry, Cars.
Welcome, and thank you very much for coming this evening to my talk about cars and how I learned to stop worrying and love public transport. This is inspired by the Gary Newman song Cars. And I kind of chose this song because it kind of talks about one of the things about cars, which is the song talks about sort of alienation and being in transporting. So I kind of thought, well, I'd do this. I mean, I've done a couple of these talks before, so I would talk to you about I kind of partly a personal experience about why I think public transport's important. Part of it's professional. I work for, as I'll describe in a minute, for Network Rail, but this is actually a personal talk, and it's kind of done as a sort of side hobby about some of the stuff that I do and I talk about, and visualization, some of the conclusions I've reached. So as it says here, it's an online talk that looks at trying to get from A to B using a train or public transport. I had hoped to be able to do a bit more about the intermodal bit. So how do you get to the station in the first place? And I'll talk a little bit about that. I also talk a little bit about why people are so hooked onto cars. And then go into a little bit more around that. So hopefully you can see there, and there's some visualizations and some images about how you can actually look at where you can get to and why I think public transport is important. So there you go. Hello, welcome. It's the Leeds Digital Festival 2025. I think as one of the people previously mentioned, they tried to make one of my talks before. I'll tell you in a minute how many I've been and done before, but we shall see. But so there you go. So this is part of the Leeds Digital Festival 2025, and hooray! Leeds Digital Festival is now having been here for 10 years, but I didn't know that, even though I used to work in Leeds back in the day. So there you go. This is me. I'm Will Deakin. I get paid to work with technology. I then work for Network Rail. I do a load of stuff around big IT systems, and then I kind of realised I was getting a bit jaded. I also do some stuff about European infrastructure management stuff and some regulation piece. And then, as it says here, by night I use data science to think about ways we can make things do. And as you'll see, I kind of do some stuff, and a lot of the stuff I'm working on either gets posted on Fostodon, which is a Mastodon clone, or on LinkedIn. There you go. So I've done Leeds Digital 22, 23, 24. So this is my, there you go, 1, 2, 3, 4, fourth year. So there you go. I also did a digital festival in Sheffield. And I'm also fortunate enough, because of contacts, to do various talks with some of the folk at Sheffield University or Leeds Institute of Transport Studies. I mean, I actually find it quite an interesting way because it kind of focuses me, and you kind of get quite a good. I find actually writing these talks and actually presenting is quite a good way to kind of work out whether what I'm talking about makes sense or not, because quite often it makes perfect sense to me. But as somebody at work said, you're very articulate, but you're sometimes very difficult to understand. Anyway, there you go. That's my day job. So Network Rail is an interesting organisation. It only really looks after infrastructure. But we have a trains portfolio. So I sit in a centralised function that deals with projects and delivery. I act as the technical lead in this space, where I'm really do a lot of assurance work. So I'd look at other people's designs and suppliers' designs and see it hangs together. And it's primarily because it's trains, it's related to timetable planning, operations and performance systems. So there you go. So the original talk was going to be called Our Friends Electric. So part of the reason why I do these talks is to try and find a one-hit wonder, which technically Tubeway Army was. But when I actually presented it, I was told that Our Friends Electric was too cryptic, and that the people who run the Leeds Digital Festival would prefer to try and attract people with a slightly more straightforward. So I went for Gary Newman's alternative song. But even that was too much. So I ended up having to produce it like this, because apparently you shouldn't have words on your slide. And this is me giving a talk to some students, trying to convince them that actually maybe they ought to consider a role working in the rail industry. So there you go. The stuff I do, I tend to publish on GitHub. So, and I actually had some nice comments back on this. So I've been working collaboratively with some people from the Institute of Transport Studies and others on various bits and pieces of projects. I'm kind of in the pre-press stage with trying to get a paper published around network simplification. But other than that, yeah. So if people are interested in the technical side of things, you can do that, or alternatively, follow me on there. So yeah, my point here is I'm no longer on Twitter or X. I found it was getting increasingly unpleasant, and it wasn't really for me. So next bit. So where did it begin? This is me as a callow youth holding toast, possibly with hangover. A friend of mine once described this as my twink stage, which I'm not sure how I meant to do that, but it was many years ago. I'm a physicist by training, and that's an X-ray machine behind me and some oscilloscopes because that looks important. So what about public transport? So I'll just kind of give you some caveats. There's a lot of stuff I could talk about. I could talk about active travel. I could talk about electrification and electricity, why that's a good thing. I could talk about rail freight, which I have also done in a talk. One of the key areas. So I was in a session last week where we had various speakers, including somebody who was actually heavily involved in Transport for London. And it was kind of like a rail oriented one, and they were talking about London Overground trains. And part of the piece that I'm going to actually pick up here is going to actually start going into some stuff around equity and equality of distribution, but that's kind of later on. So I've kind of got, I mean, it depends how you look at it. I was once described as a whinging northerner because I do think there's actually a difference in the provision of public transport, and that kind of actually affects the ability of people to take public transport. But their admission was so London, the mayoralty there has actually got some pretty impressive stories to tell about how they got people into public transport. But their dirty secret, as it was admitted, is that the majority of people take the bus, and then the tube or the Elizabeth line kind of second or third in terms of what they've gone. And they've also got some trams, but then there's kind of general. But they've got to set this ambitious target that they want within the 10 million people who live within central London, they would like to have 80% of them only travelling through active travel or public transport by 2040. And that seems like quite a long way away, but that's far in excess of the kind of targets that we have set pretty well anywhere else in the country. I won't really be talking about coding. Again, if you're interested in how I've done some of this stuff, it's a bit hacky at the moment. When I get stuff into a position where it's actually usable, I'll do that. But yeah, I kind of publish my code. I want to be open about where I've got it, what the data is, so that people can reproduce what I've been doing. So background. Cars. So there's lots of downsides to cars. They emit. They produce air pollution. They're quite noisy. They actually have so the effect of having lots of places paved to allow cars to move around has actually an adverse effect to do with how hot certain urban environments get. And actually, by paving over large quantities of the ground, you actually then end up with a localized flooding risk. So if, as possibly a consequence of global warming, you end up with kind of convective weather events, extreme thunderstorms, one of the problems you've got then with having lots of hard stuff which water can't soak into is if it lands, it tends to gather and flood. The urban heating risk, there's been some work looking at if you're within a metre or 2 metres of a car during the day, it actually causes there a 2 or 3 degree rise in air temperature around that. Alternatively, trees have an opposite effect. I mean, noise pollution is obvious, and I'll talk a little bit more about emissions. So emissions, I mean, I'm primarily talking about carbon dioxide and palm dioxide equivalent. So I did this a while ago, and I've talked about this. And for this talk, I've now updated the chart. So there you go. This is the kind of emissions line. If you look at the overall emissions since 1990 for the UK, they've dropped. They've slightly over halved. There's a bit of a debate about whether that's because we've offshored a lot of our heavy industry or whether we become more efficient. We've certainly had a massive impact, coal fire powered electricity generation. We have moved to a significant part, and I think there were parts of last year and this year where we've had over 50% of all our electricity generation through new renewable sources. And on the basis of that, you look at this, but then if you kind of look at what you've got, you see that actually pretty well since 1990, the CO2 emissions, while in total it's halved, basically we flatline when it comes to transport. And why is that? So, well, actually, one of the key parts is aviation. I'm not going to talk about that really. But yes, given the number of miles and the number of people it transports, aviation is just bad if you're interested in trying to address carbon dioxide. Private transport then comes as a much more significant increase. And then you've obviously got road freight, shipping freight, and then public transport pops at the top. I mean, there is some disparity here to do with the number of journeys made and the number of people moved, but actually there is a kind of a big piece. One of the figures, though, if you actually kind of dig into this, kind of it talks about is the fact that actually the actual movement of an electric vehicle, and that does include cars, but also specifically electric trains, is that actually you can't measure the carbon dioxide impacts. There's obviously some costs because you've got to build the railway infrastructure, but once it's out there, so actually when you look at the kind of top line there, that's primarily to do with buses and diesel powered trains. But even then, given the miles and number of people that transport, it's an enormously efficient. Moving people and freight around on steel wheels is actually a very, very efficient way of moving stuff around. So weather impact, I mentioned this, so there is a kind of effect. So there's the effect of global warming. There's also the effect of localized heating. So during kind of hot summers, actually cars aren't great. And then there's also, as I said, the kind of impact of local flooding. What else is there that cars are bad at? Well, I was looking at some papers around this, and I came across this phrase road violence. I think it's a Dutch term that's used to describe the kind of impact around what cars do to people. There's another problem, which is actually cars are quite expensive to run and maintain. So there's this kind of idea that by introducing car suppressing measures that we're actually disadvantaging the less well off. Well, actually, to some extent that might be true, but actually, if you look at the truly the least financially viable, the people who are most limited budgets, they are significantly not having access to cars or vehicles. So actually, by framing the kind of, oh well, we can't do this, we will exclude people, isn't true. There are then physical problems, which is, as a human being, you need to get out there and move. I mean, we're kind of encouraged to walk a certain amount of time. And if all you're doing is spending your time in a car, then you aren't necessarily taking that exercise. In fact, public transport kind of forces you to move about the place. And actually, and I kind of go back to the sort of the lyrics that you get from the song Cars. It very much talks about being on your own and being isolated, which to some extent can feel safe, but it actually also then can lead to a kind of whole series of issues to do with mental health and challenges. In fact, one of the things that's quite interesting is that part of the justification, or a significant part of the justification, as to why there is an over 60 or over 65 move toward bus transport, as I understand it, is based around that the fact that it encourages older people to get out and travel, and part of that is a social piece, but part of that's actually to go out and meet people. So by making it free, tackling some of the challenges around poverty in older generations, and actually the health benefit of getting people to move, you can actually deal with it, and that's most easily dealt with and more effectively done through the use of public transport. I mean, there's kind of an argument you might want to extend that to young people, but that's kind of a conversation for a different talk. Road violence, there you go, there's the numbers. This is the latest numbers from 2023. There were 1,600 people killed. A significant number of them were occupants of cars. But then there are also, if you look at that, there aren't many pedestrians or even pedal cyclists going around killing other people, but they are being mown down in a very significant rate. I mean, if this was treated as a health care activity, we would actually call it out as a major issue. I know at work we are very much focused on a kind of a health and safety based approach. That is a lot of people. And then if you then look at people who are killed or seriously injured, casualties, that's 30,000. And then something like 133,000 people are involved in some form of incident sufficient for having reported. And that doesn't feel good, particularly if you then dive into who that is. I mean, there's a lot of stuff in there, and well, if you're interested in such things, you might want to have a look at the Road Casualty Report. I know the Institute for Transport Studies is very interested in. I mean, one of the professors there, Robin Lovelace, who I know, does a lot of work looking at trying to get people to do active travel. And one of the big disinhibitors is the fear of being involved in an accident as a cyclist or even as a pedestrian. So the roads in the UK are not as safe or safe in a way that maybe they could be. And this actually then leads me on to the next point, which is the kind of idea of, so I've talked about the health impact. So would be good if I could remember how I've actually structured this. But yeah, so as I've mentioned, there is a disbenefit for not moving. And then we kind of get onto this idea of motor normivity. So this is kind of an idea that's been championed by Ian Walker and this Marco T. Bloomsloot. So apologies for my terrible pronunciation of Dutch names. And it's this kind of idea. So as I said, if you've kind of got that number of people being hurt and injured and damaged through significant amount of an activity, why isn't it challenged? And in this paper, they kind of go on to talk about this. I mean, it's sometimes called car brainedness, which is the fact that there are tiered and layered things that stop people thinking about. So if you look at the number, so if you kill somebody in a car, you're significantly less likely to end up in prison than if you killed somebody, even if it's an accident, in any other way. If you look at issues to do with theft, so if a car is stolen, that's seen as being a much more impactful crime than if, say, so it's an item that's left out in the road. If I left my bicycle out in the road or my laptop out in the road and it was stolen, there would be far less sympathy. So there's a kind of idea that cars are kind of like special. If you look at the way that we advertise and look at it, there's a lot of stuff I mean, I was quite surprised at how surreal or kind of, and the idea is that it's kind of about selling an idea of individual freedom. And one of the challenges, again, talking to the Transport for London, is that although they've got some good stories to say about the inner city areas, they're really struggling in the ring because people don't want to get out of their cars. So why is that? And part of it's to do with it's completely normalized. The conversations I often hear at work about incidents of activities or safety often then move quickly on to, and then I was in my car, or so we've kind of almost internalized this idea of the car in our personal relationships. We then end also kind of with these ideas about how people see themselves. I mean, so there was kind of apocryphal statement about, if you're still taking public transport over the age of 30, then you must be a failure in life. So then there's kind of whole cachet about the success that you can mark on this. The way that the media news and everything talks about this, so the kind of the fourth estate describes activities around cars, so people who block roads are much more harshly judged than, say, people who are carrying out other forms of protest or criminal activity. And then finally, this then feeds into a kind of discussion about how this then affects people who are making policy decisions in government. So one of the challenges that you've got around a lot of this stuff is the fact that, I mean, all right, I am told that under a previous administration, whenever people started talking about active travel or public transport, to the Minister of State, the conversation had to be framed in such a way that the discussion ended on with and this is good because it means there will be fewer cars on the road, which means that those people who have got cars can get there quicker. So again, you've kind of got a whole apparatus and sort of discussion and thought about this. So and then but it then becomes a self-perpetuating issue. So if the cus if you're on the bus and it's delayed and it's stuck in traffic, what do you do about that? People then get put off their ability to travel by bus, so they get in the car, so they're stuck in traffic, and then they're making it worse for the bus. So there's kind of a whole series of challenges that we need to kind of consider at some way societal. And I'm going to stop going on about my piece, but I think it's quite interesting if you think and you just kind of like note. And I should make this. So I've had a car for many years. Last year, 18 months ago, I sold it because living where I do in Sheffield, I just found that it really wasn't ever getting used. It would sit on the car on our drive for much of the week. It might be used for a bit of shopping and possibly an occasional trip out on the weekend. And again, they're kind of expensive. So there's a lot of discussions that go on about the economics of it. So and it's like, oh, how expensive is public transport? But part of it's also to do with the fact that you've got a sunk cost. If you've got a car, you've got to do a bunch of stuff. And so therefore that will also influence ways. So there's kind of a whole things that are mediating against this kind of idea. And that's kind of the point for me with the entry idea of this kind of how I learned to love public transport, was to try and actually think about the way I wanted to carry on differently. Anyway, so there you go. I'll then move on to the A to B bit, so we can't pretend it. So part of this then is about when you're planning a journey, kind of how does it operate? Well, so if you're going to use public transport, again, it becomes a bit more difficult. It's not leave the house, get in the car, drive to the place, find a parking spot, get out, go to where you want to do. You've got to kind of think about multimodal journeys. And again, this is where I'd like to see, and I'd hope to do more around this, and I kind of just run out of time, which is I was going to try and look at some stuff to do with, and actually we've got to a point where we've got some technology that allow you to do, so which actually allows you to do routing based on different, so you can kind of say, well, I would like to get from here to here, and it'll give you a route based on driving or a taxi, but you then can also go back and say, well, actually, I would like to use walking, cycling, and a train, and it'll kind of route that traffic around that. So we've kind of got to a level of maturity around data and understanding using open data sources such as OpenStreetMap and publications of some of the stuff that we've got around timetabling, that it's actually possible to do that. The only thing is, as I've discovered, it's actually quite computationally intensive. So again, I think the next thing to do is to kind of think a little bit about how we can make that more accessible to people. Anyway, so the first part about it is, you know, one of my big questions when I try and start doing this is where am I going to draw the boundary? I remember doing a piece of work when I was trying to look at building a high-speed railway for the whole of Europe. Didn't work very well, but it was at least an interesting thought experiment I talk about. And it's kind of like, where's Britain? Okay, so and as I've discovered also, this is quite a politically sensitive topic. For historical reasons, the term British has actually got some challenging meaning for some people who are part of the islands of Northern Europe. But anyway, so I'm kind of talking about the big green bit on the right-hand side that you can connect to, right? So the next thing about it is I'm going to try and do this via data. So I kind of need to look at some stuff to do where people is. So I've chosen to use, I mean, there are a number of different data sets. This one, I mean, I have worked with there's an open population data set, which is very good. And it's actually layered across a kind of 5 kilometer. There's then another data set, which is based on census data. So the stuff that I've been doing here is primarily based around the 2021 census. And the way that works is it's hierarchical. So what I've shown you here is a map of all the places. And what they try and do as part of the census for England and Wales in one group, and then Scotland, which is the Library of Scotland data, they kind of try and find about, I don't know, 50 or 100 people, and then call that a population centre. And that area is either called a data zone in Scotland or a output area. And then they kind of have a series of hierarchies. So that's a picture of all of the output areas and data zones in Great Britain. So, and then you can kind of start doing some stuff. So where do people live? So if you kind of slice the country, I kind of did a visualization which kind of looks at the bounds. So what you see is that there's a series of, this is basically you kind of slice the country into 100-meter slices and then work out where, and then color them so the darker bands are more people. So you can see that there's kind of an interesting distribution east, west, and north, south. And I mean, another thing that I've done just to work it out was the population centre of the UK, or sorry, actually no, it is the UK, is a small cul-de-sac just north of Coventry Airport. So there's constant arguments about where is the centre of Britain. So I think it's just north of there, and that kind of comes up a little bit in a minute. So stop me if you heard this one before. This is kind of like the topic of the previous one, which is about passenger flow. So I've done some stuff. This is what happens if you try and look at the travel to work at the middle super output layer, which is the next 2 layers up from the output area. And this is what you get if you then try and visualize it. What you see is that there's a lot more car travel on the right hand side. There's a lot more public transport, and a lot of it's very London centric, as you can see there. It's kind of like very urban. So you can see Birmingham, Manchester, Leeds, then Sheffield, Leicester, Derby, Nottingham, kind of along there. And then there's not so much. So it's kind of quite interesting how the right hand side is public transport, the left hand side is car travel. So, and this is the bit that I'm probably relatively well known for, because did you know I was interviewed by Bloomberg? People seem that's important. And this is the kind of stuff I've been doing around just looking at passenger flow for rail transport. And I think the conclusion, I'm waiting for the 23-24, but I think we've kind of returned to pre-COVID levels. COVID is the picture in the middle. Anyway, so hidden hinterland. So what have I done for this particular talk? I've kind of started looking at what does it involve to get between places. So what I've done here is to say, well, and it's a bit complicated, but if I take an output area and then look at everybody's within different radius. So I kind of draw a circle and say how many people are within, and the first block is 20 kilometers. And you can see again, you've got a tendency towards London, but then you can kind of see at the 20-kilometer limit, you kind of can see a pattern that's based around the major urban centres. If you then move to the next level, which is the kind of 80-kilometer, 80-kilometer level, you can again see, and you can see actually there is a lot of people who are living in and around central London. So that's obviously an agglomeration that's quite important. And then the final one is that if you kind of go to the 80 to 100-kilometer line, which is the one on the right hand side, you then start seeing actually a pattern that I kind of didn't expect. But once you get to that level, you start seeing a thing where actually there's a preponderance that is where you kind of link the West Midlands through to Yorkshire across to the northwest, and you end up with similar levels of population. So the kind of figures we're talking about. So at the kind of 40-kilometer level, the northern point here, which is this blob around Manchester and Leeds, has about 6 million people, where at an equivalent level around central London, it's about 12 million. If you then jump up to the 80-kilometer limit, which is the kind of one on the right hand side, what you actually then see is that you then end up with somewhere in the region of about 16 million people within that sort of orangey blob around the northwest, and then you end up with so you then end up with about 18 million within central London. So you're then kind of getting, rather than it being sort of like twice as many, you end up with a situation where you've kind of got an agglomeration that's based around being within, I don't know, 10 or 20%. So, and actually the other thing, just to kind of test this, what I did then is to say within 1%, if you look at all the peak population output areas, where are they? So at the 40-kilometer on the left hand side, you can see that there's definitely a central point in Manchester, there's one in Birmingham, one in London. If you then move to the 60-kilometer one, you start seeing the centre actually moves. And then when you move to the 80-kilometer route, it jumps. So what actually happens is that you end up with a combination of the North and Midlands tends towards a single centralised section. And this is kind of an idea of where I've got just basically plotted those different circular pieces with the different centres based on their piece. So you kind of end up with this smearing. Once you go beyond about 100 kilometres to 150 kilometres, you basically end up with the whole of the bits that people live, which is the whole of the central UK. So one of the other things I was going to go on, so I've kind of tried to make the case that actually there is this bimodal or grouping of people that's sort of like a preponderance sort of in the north. That piece then is kind of a little bit linked to this kind of idea here on the right hand side, an 80-kilometer range that sort of, and it happens to be in a field just northwest of Leek, which is a small town in Staffordshire. Um, Here in London, it tends just to be southern, the western side of London. So on that basis, can we then look at any kind of conclusions we can draw around? So one of the things you can look at in terms of service provision. So one of the things that, so I'm going to take a minute just to explain the thing that people like and what kind of encourages them to take public transport is the fact that when they feel it's reliable and it's safe and that they are able to access it at a reasonable price. And so you then start getting into conversations, and I'm not going to talk about the economics of it until the end, but you start getting into conversations about, well, what does reliable and safe mean? Well, safe is, can you get on and off, and do you feel comfortable in a way that you might not? Because if you treat the inside of your car as an extension of your house, that gives you a very different experience. So public transport is a public space, and that's part of the reason why this kind of whole individualistic thing seems to kind of land quite well with people. Is how comfortable are you with dealing with strangers? But also part of it's to do with the fact that, I mean, as my daughter's discovered today, she's had a terrible experience getting back because various buses were running late or cancelled. The train was running late and was very crowded. So she's not really enjoyed it very much today at all. So, and what can you do about that? And part of that then becomes to do with, and then also things like crowding levels and uncertainty about being able to get a seat. So the thing that my wife gets quite exercised about is where you have trains that potentially have seats, but then there's all of the seats are booked. Well, what do you do? Or you get on a train and you're standing, and because trains tend to travel quite long distances, standing up for a couple of hours, which I have had to do, I think the longest I did was 4.5 hours, is just really uncomfortable. And you kind of then think, well, I've paid all this money. Why is that? So you've got to kind of start looking at provision of service and service quality, but also frequency to enable you to have enough capacity to allow to move the people who want to move about the place. And as part of that, I thought, well, I'd look at the timetable. So a part of this. So when do trains operate? So if you kind of take the timetable, and I did this for a week in August, what you find is that actually you're probably not doing a very good job if you want to catch a train after midnight and before 6 o'clock in the morning. But if you kind of want to travel between about 6:30 and 9 o'clock in the evening, there's actually a pretty high level of service. And I've kind of broken this down based on the different train operating companies. And interesting, Northern, although it's the one with one of the largest areas to cover, also has some of the highest levels. But then if you look at the next one, ScotRail, again, a huge area, but a lot of train services. Then you kind of go underground, southeast and southwestern. So the kind of middle band there and into southern tends to dominate. But this is a kind of, so I've taken a week, I've then looked at all of the dates, added it up, and that's a kind of count of the number of service activity that you get across the network. I've then done the similar thing where I've kind of done the same graph, but rather than, as you can see, the 3rd of August to do the week. So you can see Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. So there is a bit of a variation in the middle of the day. It's actually in contrast to some of the European countries. So if you look at France, they have a very high peak flow at morning peak for rush hour, and then a very high flow, and then try and travel at any point between about 10:30 and 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and you're stuffed. So one of the things I kind of demonstrated with this is that there's actually quite a high level of overall flow. And then I thought, well, what I ought to do is to try and turn it into a map. So there you go. I mean, I've kind of popped this on various bits of social media. So this is basically taking the 19th of August and then looking at in kind of hour slices the total number of reported activities in the timetable. And you kind of end up with, and you kind of this kind of slightly weird heartbeat effects where, and I mean, it's basically a kind of an animation of the thing that you've seen. So it's quite difficult to travel after midnight through to 6 o'clock in the morning, but as soon as after that, suddenly you start seeing. But you also then see that there's a kind of a lot of services that are operating in and out of the southeast of England, and probably less so around the north. So if you look at the major cities in the north of England, you can see that there is a lot of travel and services, but they tend to be concentrated, getting you just in and out of quite a narrow distance. Whereas the I don't know, the pool, the hinterland, the area behind traveling into London is actually a much longer distance. And there you go. This is a map of doing the same thing, but this is just basically looking at point reporting the location, and it's done at a 10-minute interval. And at some point, you might start seeing some stuff happening in Amsterdam. There you go, and France. So that's Paris, and that's Amsterdam. So that's the Eurostar. Because I don't have access to the network model for Europe, I couldn't do the similar one to the one before. Anyway, so we kind of end up in this conversation about equality or equity. So, based on the numbers I've kind of presented around 80-kilometer pitch, a kind of 16.5 million to 19 million. Is there a kind of a disparity that we're seeing with the way that we're actually having provision, and why might that be? So, as I said, this is the kind of stuff where you actually look at just the number of passengers, and you can see what a mate of mine described as the monster that hovers over the Cthulhu, the elder god that lands over London. If you then look at the timetable services, and I've done this then based on the hinterland model, where I've kind of looked at where people are traveling within 40 miles of that, you see this. So what you can see is that there's actually quite a lot of services that are focused on travel into London out to about 40 kilometers. So that's 40 kilometers radius, so that's actually 80 kilometers traveled. If you then look at the equivalent for the cities in the north of England, it's not doing that. I mean, you aren't seeing anywhere near the same, and it's similar. So you can kind of see Reading across to the left. You aren't seeing the same level of provision of services between Leeds and Manchester, or Sheffield and Leeds even, despite the fact that they are significant urban centres. If you then look at the situation for the kind of 80-kilometre radius hinterland, or the 100 miles, as it were, again, you're not seeing anything better. In fact, arguably, I mean, Birmingham now appears, because that then starts becoming part of this kind of transport network. But I think there's a kind of still some level of disparity. So I'm going to get onto the work in progress. So the conclusion of the talk is going to be, I've talked at you for probably about 40 minutes. I'll then continue for a little bit longer. I'll take a Q&A and then just make some final remarks, if that's okay. So the thing that I was hoping to get to was this kind of idea of intermodal travel. And to do that, this first point is to try and work out how can you easily access. So if you look at walking using OpenStreetMap data, so I've done a piece where I've taken the whole of all of the routable walking places that you can go. That's where you can walk to. The bits that are in green are where you'd have to get in a canoe or take a boat. So I've kind of ruled those out. And as part of that, I thought, well, what would that look like if I then tried to do some stuff where I would say, well, as a first step to building this intermodal model, from getting you from A to B to making some recommendations, what would that look like in terms of taking the output areas? So that's what we've got here. And then looking at what that might look like as a routable map. And you kind of end up with this. So the left-hand side is a kind of, I don't know, the pure map. Let's a walk. Let's take a walk. And on the right-hand side, what I've gone and done. So what the idea is that, so I've taken all the output areas. I've then overlaid all of the stations in the UK. Sorry, in Britain. I need to be careful, otherwise I know how annoying it is to be misnationed. And look at what the model would look like if you take the shortest walking path between each of the stations. So the right hand side kind of shows you where all the stations are. The left hand side shows you the kind of map and the pattern, and you end up with those kind of like I don't know if you've seen those the riverine, the kind of river maps that you get, where you kind of look at where the tendency is for people to travel towards a particular place. It's kind of wrong because it's based on shortest distance, and sometimes people will want to travel to a major station rather than a local station. But this is the kind of where you get to. And this is what you get. So this is the 80-kilometer distribution. For on the left-hand side, you've got London, and on the right-hand side, you've got that kind of north of England approach. And one of the things I take around this is the fact that there does seem to be a different density. So if I look at, so remember, this is the kind of 16.5 million to 19 million. So there is a difference. 2.5 million, but it's still not a huge difference. But if you kind of look at the general distances you need to walk in the north of England to get to a thing, and then, I mean, part of it you can't get over it is there is the Peak District. So that big white blob in the middle is Kinder Scout moving up to the Pennines. So again, geography is difficult, but you've still got a lot of people that you can move around. So you end up with a kind of different shape, and this is more like an annular, so it's kind of like a donut shape rather than maybe a more concentrated model. But once you start moving out, you then start seeing a different set of patterns. But even within the central urban core, you've got a different distribution of stations. Actually, apologies. That is the 40-mile view. 40-kilometer radius view. This is the view when you actually get to 80 kilometers. So this is the kind of outlook, and this is where you can start seeing the kind of walking path that you need to take in Birmingham, which is down at the bottom. And this is what you get if you look at a similar pattern. So it's kind of interesting. You've kind of got this very core set around London, around certain urban areas, but actually it starts to become much sparser once you start moving out. And you can see when you kind of get into the periphery here, you've actually got some people having to travel, and there's quite a lot of people needing to walk quite long distances. So while there's a case to be made, and you can kind of see the Thames drifting through that there is actually within this kind of urban kernel zone within London, there are still issues. So one of the things that I was kind of, again, talking to Transport for London, their kind of idea around all of this is that, the idea shouldn't be to necessarily knock down or make it harder for people in London. And I agree with this, it's about trying to making it possible for people to take public transport and rail transport outside of that core area. So there you go. So what? What's going on? So transport funding. I mean, I'm just going to put this out there. So if you look at the amount of money per person per year, so GBP, so pounds per head per person, looks like that. It's a little bit complicated by the fact that they also include capital expenditure, so the building of stuff, as well as the stuff to do with the operational cost and subsidy. But according to these numbers, London is having, I don't know, 3 or 4 times the amount of money spent on it around public transport and transport in total than East Midlands and the South West. Yorkshire and the Humber is significantly down, whereas London and the North West. And I think part of the conclusion that I've kind of reached is you get what you pay for. I'm not sure why these decisions have been made. I've tried to make a case that actually there is a significant build up that you would want to say around the Northwest, the West Midlands, Yorkshire and Humber, based on the kind of distribution of population. And if you are going to get to a position where you are looking at a similar level of provision or a similar level of investment, and this is kind of this equity. So is this fair? I'd kind of argue it probably isn't. But that's not to say that London should then be starved of its kind of funding. But I think there should be some level of redistribution, certainly when there are. So if you've got, I don't know, a quarter of the population accessing the public transport, a third of the population accessing public transport in London, and a quarter of the population accessing public transport in the Northwest through to Leeds and then down to Birmingham, then there should actually be more investment in that. And there's another case around this. I mean, just talking anecdotally, I mean, I know some people in the tech scene here in Sheffield, and they do make the point, and I think the same point's been made to me about people I know in Leeds, where I worked for 15 years. It is a problem. It is actually a barrier to actually and being able to grow business, because the kind of agglomeration effects of having people who you can talk to, meet up with, work with, get to work even, is a disinhibitor to actually being able to run a successful business in a way. So, and then you kind of end up in this kind of argument around whether, do you see public transport as a thing that is a utility that needs to be paid for, in a bit the way that we've kind of privatized gas, water, and electricity, or do you see it as for the common good, and is actually a kind of a mechanism by which you can actually encourage and provide public economic growth? Anyway, sorry, I've kind of gone on at some length, so thank you very much for your patience. I hope that was kind of what you were expecting or not. I'm just going to stop sharing the screen so I can see hands and just say, has anybody got any thoughts, comments, any questions? And then on the basis of this, I've then probably got about 5 minutes just to finish off and close out the talk. I mean, hopefully I told you it was about traveling from A to B. I've done some data visualization. I've talked about some of the challenges we've got. I don't know if it's what you were expecting. So please, does anybody have a question?
Hi. Yeah, I was just thinking where in terms of that capital expenditure, and I know it's often been said that governments see it as more worth, they get more return on investment for all the investment in London transport, and that's why they keep doing it. But I was thinking recently, you've got all the like more or less the triangle between West Yorkshire and South Sheffield, Doncaster, and that whole general area. There's lots of people in there. I know that better than the Manchester side of it, and yet the public transport tends to be quite often once an hour, quite slow.
Yeah.
And I thought, even just compare it to the other side of Leeds, where you've got the electric trains up the Airedale and Wharfdale line, and I was just imagining if you could get fast, good acceleration electric trains and then increase the frequency to like every 30-20 minutes, just what a difference that would make along there.
And I agree, and that's kind of what I'm trying to show here, is the fact that that's not just a feeling. If we look at the numbers, it's clear that there is a problem here, which is that there is, even allowing for a 30% difference, looking at that kind of 80-kilometer radius bit, which is kind of where I think railway works quite well.
Mm-hmm.
There's a definite significant difference in the provision of service, whether that comes to, I mean, one of the things I would like to look at would be actually the size of trains. So I've kind of talked about frequency of service. There's also a thing that, you know, you could look at how big and the type of trains. I mean, until recently, that data has been quite difficult to get hold of as an open data, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. But I think you're right. And I mean, there's a kind of a question about, I mean, you make an interesting point about, oh, you'll get more bang for your buck in London. Well, that's fine, but you'll still get a bang for your buck. You know, you'll get still a significant return for your investment in the north of England. So,
yeah, I should say that that is literally what I heard being used as justification for putting all the money into London.
well, I know,
think-
but it's like, well,
idea.
you know, I mean, it's kind of like, you know, it's kind of a bit, it's a bit strange, because it's like, you know, if I mean, so the point about investment, if you're trying to drive an economy, I would argue, is the fact that as long as you're not losing money, then you should consider making that investment.
Mm-hmm.
I'd also then say that historically we've been very bad at modeling transport growth. So I mean, the size of the Elizabeth line was kind of meant to be sized so that it would actually run out of capacity, I think, in 2035, and it's already at capacity. So I think part of the problem we've also got is that the economic models we're using to justify that are just wrong. So you've kind of got a challenge around modeling. You've got then a challenge around something else. Anyway.
Yeah. Conversely, by the way, I heard that it's in the German constitution that if any region falls behind the rest of the country, that's supposed to automatically get extra investment, which is kind of the exact opposite.
Yeah. So I've just seen a note from Joseph. Is Northern Powerhouse still fit for purpose? Okay, so I'm going to play I'm very sorry. I'm a non-departmental, so I work for a department government body, so I've got to be a little bit careful about what I say, other than just to generally say that I think I can make a reasoned case about so I think part of it's to do with, I mean, I think part of it is there's a problem with just investing in public transport. I think there's an idea that actually wouldn't it be great if the market could pay for all this stuff? And I don't think there's I mean, to go back to the point I think Peter was just making, I don't think there's actually a kind of sufficient return on investment. I think then there's a kind of a whole thing about there's delays. It's kind of like, well, part of the challenge though is that you've kind of, if you start building your railway infrastructure now, you won't necessarily see it delivering benefit to the economy until 10 years later. And with an electoral cycle of 5 years, it kind of becomes that. But I mean, there's also an argument that says that maybe politicians should just do the right thing and stick to that. But part of the problem then also is that I don't think we've got a consensus about the right thing to do here. I mean, one of the things that's kind of happened, I mean, I think the German model is one of the ones, the Dutch, there's not really an argument so much about investing in public transport infrastructure in a way that it seems to be highly controversial in this country, and that we try and deal with it that way. So, has anybody else got any other questions? Otherwise, I will just move. Go on, Dahlia. Sorry, I know
Hey,
Dahlia.
Will.
Hey.
Yeah, really interesting presentation, really interesting visualization. So I think I just need a bit more time to digest it. But I'm really curious to see the impact of devolution across the UK, and whether or not that transfers to, you know, that kind of public transport funding. It doesn't seem like it does, so I wonder where that's going.
I mean, I think there's kind of like two parts to that. So I think the first part about it is, I think what I've kind of shown is that the bits that are going to be devolved in terms of, I mean, if you're talking about Wales and Scotland, they kind of don't have they don't have the same number of people. So part of my argument for this is that at an 160 kilometer diameter, 100-mile reach, there just aren't that number of people in Wales or in Scotland.
Yeah.
So there's going to be a challenge there, which is the money you need to spend. I think what's interesting, and then I'll go back to the other thing that this colleague I met at this event last week was talking. The majority of people take buses, whether you like it or not. And in fact, one of the things that actually been a massive disinhibitor for one of the things that happened in London was that the buses were kept under the mayoralty, so they're actually being centrally controlled, and where everywhere else in England, Wales, and Scotland they were privatized. Okay, and there were kind of rules put in to stop local authorities from controlling the market. What's interesting is looking at experiments such as what's happening in Scotland and in Wales and in Manchester around how actually we're starting to see significant investment, and it's starting to happen in South Yorkshire as well, which is that actually by taking under control, under public control. So it's not ownership, it's about having a planned set of services. You start actually seeing a significant increase because you can cap fares, you can start doing things about, you know, one of the problems you've got at the moment here is that if I want to get to somewhere and it takes 2 buses, I've got to pay to get there and back 4 bus fares. Whereas in London, there's a kind of idea of having a capped ticket. And that's being introduced in Wales and in Scotland. And it's also then one of the nice things about that model in those devolved areas is they're actually looking at, so I know Scotland removed peak time travel, and that's had an interesting effect on smoothing out passenger numbers. Because there's no longer a benefit or disbenefit for just ramming yourself on in the morning and then catching the first train after the peak hour. And then there's also a thing which is around having a joined up thing. So one of the points I was trying to make about this, you are reliant on a chain potentially of transport nodes if you want to travel by public transport. And that's only really effective is if you've got a kind of a guiding mind. So again, there have been seen an uptick in the number of people taking public transport in South Wales and in Scotland in the Great Glen, because they've started integrating their planning around buses, trains, and other forms of transport. But I guess what I'm trying to say is, on the other hand, there is a challenge that there just aren't that many people living there. So I'm kind of making the case for the north, this kind of northwest Yorkshire Midlands hub that probably could do with some love and attention, because it does feel like having a single travel zone within that, equivalent to the sort of central travel zone within London, might be actually quite an effective way of driving forward. And that's what the data seems to indicate. I don't know. I'm not an economist, but that's the kind of thing. But no, it's a really cool question. Parting words. Yeah, I've done some visualizations. I think I try and make them look nice. I mean, I've done visualizations that look ugly and I don't share them. So I'm there's an aesthetic piece to this. So hopefully you can see that. One of the things I've kind of done, I mean, one of the major impacts to the railway was actually the reshaping the British Railways for freight under beaching. But if you look at the number of transport, we're probably, even though we've got a much more limited network, got far fewer people involved in travel. Sorry, we've kind of returned to beaching levels. I try and get the words out right. The how. So a lot of this stuff is based around using open data. So, I mean, as it's a public talk, I try and make it reproducible by sharing the code. I try and make sure that I'm only using data that people that can attribute and is under a permissive license. So it's open data, open government license, and acknowledge that. And I think we've actually got a really good story in this country to say about that. I mean, talking to some of my colleagues across the European, we've got a lot more access to a lot more resources in public transport than we have. And why don't we do something with that? Why are we here? So I think one of the big things is about emissions. So I'm kind of really worried. That's what we're talking about. Significant investment in rail will make a difference. And the question is it going to be enough? Significant in public transport will also make a difference. Anyway, so thank you very much. Build it and they will come. Thank you. And that is the end of my talk tonight. So hopefully you enjoyed it and that it was a gave you some food for thought.
That was really excellent. Thanks so much, Will. Really appreciate it.
Okay. So sorry, thank you very much. I'll just go on camera, wave you good night and say that was my talk this year for the Leeds Digital Festival. Thank you very much for coming along.
New York Transit Queen.